It was a morning that would forever be etched in Keisha Rivers' memory, a day that began with the promise of a normal workday and ended with the shattering of everything she had worked for. Keisha, a 28-year-old assistant to Arthur Holden, the founder of Holden Enterprises, a tech conglomerate valued at billions, had been with the company for over 5 years. She had worked hard, proving herself in an environment dominated by white men in tailored suits, managing schedules, handling sensitive documents, and supporting Arthur in ways that ensured his success. But today was different. Keisha had been called into Arthur's office after a heated argument during the weekly board meeting. During the meeting, she had, for the first time, openly challenged Arthur's dismissive comments about an employee, Devin Parker, who was black, just like her. Arthur had spoken in derogatory terms about Devin, suggesting that his background would limit his ability to thrive at the company. Keisha knew better. She had seen the struggles Devin faced daily, constantly undermined by microaggressions and the subtle racism of the corporate world. And Keisha couldn't take it anymore. She stood up in the meeting, calling out Arthur's racism. "Arthur, you can't say that about Devin. It's disrespectful and it perpetuates a culture of inequality here," she had said, her voice steady but firm. The room had gone silent, all eyes on her. The discomfort in the room was palpable, as though the very air had thickened. Arthur, ever the powerful CEO, had stared at Keisha with disbelief before quickly dismissing her remarks with a wave of his hand, followed by a chilling silence. Everyone else had quietly nodded in agreement with Arthur's directive to move past it. But Keisha couldn't let it go. Keisha's heart pounded as she walked down the cold, white-walled corridor of Holden Enterprises toward Arthur's office. She knew what was coming. The door to his office was already open. Keisha entered, standing tall in her black pencil skirt and white blouse, her natural curls framing her face in defiance. She didn't allow herself to look weak. Keisha was proud, determined, and she would never back down. Arthur sat behind his polished mahogany desk, his fingers tapping rhythmically against a folder. His eyes were steely, and the air in the room felt thick with impending judgment. "Keisha," Arthur's voice sliced through the silence. "You know how important it is to keep this company's image clean. We can't afford to let personal issues spill into business." His tone was calm, but the undertone of superiority in his words hit Keisha like a slap. "Arthur, that wasn't personal. It was about doing the right thing," she said, standing her ground. Arthur stood up slowly from his chair, walking toward the window, his back to her. "You've always been a loyal employee, Keisha. But today, you crossed a line. I don't tolerate insubordination, especially when it tarnishes the company's reputation." The words hung in the air like an accusation. Keisha's stomach churned, but she held her composure. She had been through far worse than this. "Arthur," she said, her voice trembling slightly, "you can't fire me for standing up against racism." Arthur turned around, his expression cold. "Actually, I can. And I will." "You're fired, Keisha." Her breath caught in her throat. "Your actions have damaged this company's integrity. I'm sorry, but your services are no longer needed." Keisha stood there, frozen in disbelief. Everything she had worked for, all the sacrifices, the long hours, the loyalty, had amounted to nothing in that moment. But as Arthur's words echoed in her ears, a spark ignited in Keisha's chest. She wasn't going to let this be the end of her story. As she gathered her things, her mind raced with possibilities. She wasn't the same woman who had walked into that office 5 years ago. She was stronger now. She had grown. She had learned. And she was ready to build something that would change everything. As she stepped out of Arthur's office and walked through the sterile hallways for the last time, she glanced at the elevator, a symbol of the corporate ladder she had once climbed. This wasn't the end. It was just the beginning. Keisha's breath came in shallow bursts as she walked out of the glass and steel building of Holden Enterprises, the doors sliding closed behind her with a finality that felt like a door slammed shut on her dreams. Fired. After years of hard work, dedication, and proving herself in an industry that thrived on exclusivity, she was left with nothing. But inside her, something fierce began to ignite. She walked briskly down the crowded city street, the noise of Manhattan's bustling streets deafening in her ears, yet her thoughts were deafening in their own way. This wasn't just about losing a job, she thought. This was about everything they had ever tried to make me feel, small, unworthy, invisible. And now, the whole world had just seen me fail. But Keisha didn't feel failure. No, what she felt was anger, a deep, unshakable anger that burned her from within. It was anger at the system that allowed her to be dismissed simply for standing up to racism. It was anger at the corporate world that had watched people like her struggle, not because of their talent, but because of the color of their skin. She clenched her fists, the memory of Arthur's cold words still echoing in her mind. "I'm sorry, but your services are no longer needed." The words seemed to mock her, but they also stoked a fire inside her that she couldn't ignore. Keisha refused to be a casualty of the corporate world. The thought of going back to her modest apartment and slinking into the shadows of defeat was out of the question. She had been humiliated once, but she would not let that be her story. The days that followed were filled with long hours of reflection, research, and planning. Keisha realized that she had been playing by rules that were never meant for people like her to win. She wasn't about to keep chasing crumbs from tables that didn't want her there. She needed her own seat at the table. She reached out to a few of her trusted colleagues from her time at Holden Enterprises. Some had been her closest allies, people who had witnessed the undercurrent of racism that permeated the workplace. One by one, they shared stories of how they had been silenced, ignored, or even pushed out for daring to challenge the status quo. It wasn't just her. It was a pattern. Arthur Holden wasn't an anomaly, he was a symptom of a larger system. That's when the idea hit Keisha. She would build a company of her own, a company where people like her, people of color, could rise to the top without being overlooked or belittled. A company that wouldn't just be a business, but a movement. She began working late into the nights, setting up a business plan, reaching out to former colleagues in finance, tech, and media who believed in her vision. Keisha was determined. She would not just be an employee again, she would become the employer, the one who controlled the narrative, the one who held the power. Her idea? A consultancy that specialized in corporate diversity and inclusion. She wanted to force companies to see the untapped potential that was often neglected, especially when it came to marginalized communities. Her company would be the bridge between talent and opportunity, forcing major corporations to acknowledge their lack of diversity and change their ways. Months passed, and Keisha's business began to take shape. Empowered, she built a network of influential people who had seen what she saw, the way the system suppressed marginalized communities. Soon, Keisha began securing clients who were desperate to improve their diversity and inclusion efforts. Her company flourished, and with every success, the voices of doubt she had once carried with her grew quieter. But Keisha hadn't forgotten. Arthur Holden still held a place in her mind, no, not just Arthur, but the entire system he represented. She had an idea, the perfect revenge. This wasn't about destroying his career or making him feel small. It was about forcing him to face the consequences of his actions, the way his company had built its empire on the backs of people like her. Keisha started working behind the scenes, gathering information, speaking to former employees who had witnessed the discrimination, uncovering legal loopholes, and finding instances of racial bias that had been swept under the rug. Every conversation she had, every document she reviewed, every deal she made, brought her closer to her goal. She was building the case that would bring Arthur Holden and his company to their knees. The moment arrived when Keisha finally got the call. Arthur's company was up for a major expansion, and they needed a diversity consultant, someone who could create a program that would improve their diversity rankings. Arthur's people reached out to her directly. They had no idea who they were dealing with. Keisha Rivers, Arthur's assistant on the phone, asked. "We're reaching out because Holden Enterprises is in need of a top-tier consultant for our diversity program. Arthur would like to discuss a partnership with your firm." Keisha's smile was slow and deliberate. I'd be happy to discuss this. In fact, I think I have the perfect proposal for you. Keisha sat in her office that night, the phone call still fresh in her mind. Arthur Holden, the man who had once fired her, had no idea who he was about to meet. She would confront him head-on, not with vengeance, but with the power of truth. But she knew one thing for certain: this wasn't just a business deal. This was the moment when Keisha Rivers would take her first step toward dismantling the system that had been responsible for her humiliation. The stakes had never been higher. And Arthur Holden, sitting in his luxury penthouse, awaiting Keisha's proposal, had no idea the storm that was about to hit him. Keisha stood before the towering glass windows of her office, watching as the sun dipped beneath the skyline of Manhattan. The city was alive, pulsating with possibilities, and for the first time in her life, she felt the power of control in her hands. She had built her company from the ground up, and now, she was on the precipice of a reckoning that would change everything. Her phone buzzed, interrupting her thoughts. It was a message from her trusted lawyer, Marcus Harris, who had been working with her on the legal intricacies of her plan. The paperwork's ready. We're going to drop the bomb tomorrow. Tomorrow. The day she had been preparing for. The day she would confront Arthur Holden in a way he never expected. Keisha had always known that when the time came, she wouldn't have to destroy Arthur to bring him down. She simply had to expose the hypocrisy, the systemic racism that thrived under his watch, and the corporate culture he had nurtured, a culture that had hurt so many people, including her. But there was one thing Keisha hadn't counted on. One thing that had the potential to shake everything she had built. The meeting was scheduled for 10 a.m. in a conference room at Holden Enterprises, one of the most prestigious buildings in the city. Keisha was prepared. She had spent the last few months meticulously crafting the proposal for the diversity program, tailoring it to expose Holden's failures while showcasing her company's unparalleled success in creating real change in workplaces. The world Arthur Holden had spent decades building would be turned upside down in one meeting. But as the day approached, a feeling of doubt crept into her mind. She wasn't afraid of confronting Arthur. What troubled her now was the thought of the legacy she was about to shatter, not just his, but her own. What if her pursuit of justice led her to a path where she lost her moral compass? Was she still fighting for justice, or was she seeking revenge? Keisha shook off the thought. Justice was never about what she could gain personally. It was about the system that needed to be restructured, about exposing the flaws that allowed people like Arthur to get away with decades of exploitation. But it wasn't just about him anymore. It was about the lives he had destroyed. As Keisha sat in her car, just outside Holden Enterprises, she felt a moment of reflection. She had come a long way from that day in Arthur's office when he fired her for standing up to racism. She had not been silenced, and now, she was going to speak louder than ever. Keisha entered the glass-walled conference room at Holden Enterprises with a calm but determined expression. The walls were lined with sleek whiteboards, and the polished wooden table gleamed under the bright lights. Arthur Holden was already seated at the head of the table, his face betraying no emotion, but Keisha could see the arrogance in his eyes. "Keisha," Arthur said, his voice smooth as always, his eyes scanning her with practiced indifference. "I trust you prepared something impressive for us." Keisha's smile was cool. "You could say that." As she opened the folder with her carefully prepared diversity proposal, she could feel the weight of the moment settling on her shoulders. This wasn't just a business meeting. This was the confrontation. She wasn't the same woman who had walked out of this office years ago, humiliated and dismissed. She was now the one holding the keys to this kingdom. "I'm glad you've made time for this, Arthur," Keisha began, her voice firm, her tone controlled. "I have something here that not only addresses the failures of your diversity initiatives but also exposes the truth about your company's practices." Arthur's brow furrowed. "I don't know what you're talking about. My company has always been committed to diversity." Keisha leaned forward, her eyes never leaving his. "Arthur, I think we both know that's a lie. Your company's diversity program is a sham. A box you tick to avoid scrutiny while you continue to exploit people like me. People who work for you, who get crushed under a system designed to benefit those at the top. You know exactly what I mean. She handed him the proposal. As Arthur read through the meticulously prepared document, Keisha watched his face change from indifference to disbelief. The evidence was undeniable: instances of racial bias in hiring, discriminatory pay gaps, and unethical practices that had led to the exploitation of minority employees. But then, Keisha dropped the real bombshell. You also know, Arthur, she said, her voice cold, about the illegal contracts your company has signed with external vendors, many of whom exploit laborers in developing countries. You signed those contracts knowing full well the consequences they would have on those workers. Arthur's hands shook slightly as he set the proposal down. The once steady confidence he exuded had evaporated. You're threatening me with this?" he stammered, his face turning pale. "You're trying to destroy my life over a simple diversity program?" Keisha stood up. "No, Arthur. I'm not trying to destroy your life. I'm trying to make sure the world knows who you really are. You used your position to hurt so many people, including me, and now, it's time for you to face the consequences of that." Just as Arthur opened his mouth to protest, his phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen. His expression faltered. Keisha noticed. "What's the matter, Arthur? Something wrong?" Arthur's face paled even further as he read the message. It was from the board of directors. The message was simple: "We've been informed of the allegations. We're terminating the contract with Holden Enterprises immediately. A full investigation will begin." Keisha stood still, watching as Arthur's empire began to crumble before him. But the real shock came when he looked up at her, his face filled with fear. "How did you know?" he whispered. Keisha smiled. "You were never going to win this one, Arthur. Not this time." The news hit like a tidal wave. Holden Enterprises, once one of the most respected corporations in the tech industry, was now under investigation for racism, unethical contracts, and labor exploitation. The board of directors, under pressure from the media, had announced they were cutting all ties with Arthur Holden. The announcement had been made publicly, and with it, Keisha's name was suddenly everywhere. She hadn't intended for it to happen this way, but there was something deeply satisfying about seeing the world take notice of what Arthur had done. The man who had tried to erase her now had to face the consequences of his actions, and it was all because she had dared to stand up to him. Keisha stood in her office, the weight of the moment sinking in. She wasn't just the founder of a successful diversity consultancy anymore. She was the woman who had taken down one of the most powerful men in corporate America. Her phone buzzed again. This time, it was a message from Marcus Harris, her lawyer. The message read, "Arthur's company is in freefall. Lawsuits, investigations, press, he's losing everything. And guess who's being offered a spot on the diversity board for a new multinational corporation? They want you, Keisha." Keisha smiled, but it wasn't out of pride. It was out of vindication. The world was finally seeing what she had always known. That the system wasn't broken. It was designed to keep people like her out. But now, the tables were turning. 2 weeks later, Keisha sat at the head of a sleek, modern conference table in the offices of Vanguard Technologies, a multinational corporation known for its innovation in artificial intelligence. The board of directors sat in front of her, all eyes on the woman who had single-handedly changed the business landscape. "Keisha, we've heard a lot about your work," said David Matthews, the CEO of Vanguard Technologies, his voice warm but tinged with curiosity. "You've built something truly extraordinary, but we wanted to meet with you today because we know there's more to your story than just business acumen. We know about Arthur Holden. You didn't just take down a corporation, you changed the game. So, we want you to be the head of our new diversity and inclusion board, and we're offering you a significant stake in Vanguard. A position that will give you real power." Keisha didn't need time to think. She knew this was what she had been working for all these years. The opportunity to create lasting change, not just in one company, but in the entire industry. She had faced so much personal pain, so many humiliations, but now, she had the chance to use her position for something that could reshape the corporate world. "I accept," she said, her voice calm, but filled with resolve. "But it's not about what you're offering me, David. It's about what I can offer to the people who have been silenced for far too long. If you want me on your team, we're going to change the system. We're not just checking boxes. We're creating a movement." The next few months were a whirlwind of board meetings, strategic planning, and legal battles. Keisha didn't just take a seat at the table, she redefined the table itself. She spearheaded a revolutionary initiative at Vanguard Technologies that forced companies across the globe to rethink their diversity programs. Keisha's focus wasn't just on hiring practices. It was on building inclusive cultures from the ground up, where everyone, regardless of their race, gender, or background, had equal access to opportunity. And as for Arthur Holden, his downfall continued. Keisha's investigation into his company had uncovered even more damning evidence. The media had gotten hold of everything, and soon enough, Arthur was publicly exposed for his exploitation of minority employees. He was stripped of his wealth, his power, and his status. Keisha, however, wasn't interested in watching him suffer. What mattered most to her was not his destruction but the legacy she was building. The change was in motion, and it was unstoppable. Keisha sat in her office late one night, looking out over the city she had once dreamed of conquering. The lights of Manhattan flickered beneath her as she reflected on her journey. The pain, the humiliation, the struggle, it had all brought her here. But now, the fight wasn't just for herself. It was for all those who had been silenced, those who had been overlooked, and those who had been forced to play by a system that was rigged against them. She smiled softly, thinking about how far she had come. She had gone from a young woman fired for standing up against racism to a global leader in diversity. Her story had come full circle, not just because of her success, but because of the people she had empowered along the way. Her phone buzzed again, and this time, it was a message from Marcus Harris. "Keisha, the press is calling. They want an interview about the future of corporate America. They want to hear your story." Keisha typed a quick response, "Give them my number. It's time to tell the world about the real power of change." Keisha had taken her power back. But her story wasn't over. She had already proven that one person could change the world, but what could happen if more of us stood up and demanded justice? Her success wasn't just about building a company. It was about changing lives, shattering the status quo, and making sure no one was left behind. Keisha's victory was proof that no matter how dark the road may seem, we all have the power to rise above the system. And now, she had a message for you. If you've ever been told you didn't belong, if you've ever been made to feel small, rise up. Use your voice. Use your experience. And together, we'll change the world. If Keisha's story moved you, if you believe in the power of transformation, and the need for justice, subscribe to our channel for more stories that prove that no matter the struggle, victory is possible. Share this story with someone who needs to hear it, and leave a comment telling us how you are overcoming adversity and changing the game in your own life. Together, we rise. Together, we change the world.